Australia's Prime Ministerial candidates go head-to-head in a crucial election debate. From the other side of the planet, US President Trump's economic and defense policies have rattled Australia's voters. The domestic economy and security are now closely tied to foreign relations. We'll take a look at how global dynamics are influencing the Aussie vote. I'm Andrea Sankin. Today's Newsmaker is Australia. Well, it was the first question in their nationally televised debate. How will you handle Donald Trump? Liberal Party candidate Peter Dutton had just warned of tsunami waves for Australia if the U.S. goes into recession. So it's obvious managing foreign relations is a priority for voters. Now, much like Canada, Australians are now looking for a leader who can buck the Trumpian populism they fear could take their economy down. So is it safer to stick with incumbent Anthony Albanese or move forward on a right-wing path instead? Here's a look at what their first debate could say about the vote.
Australia is heading to the polls, deciding who their next government will be on May the 3rd. So who are the two party leaders? There's current Prime Minister Anthony Albanese of the Labor Party. Albanese has, for much of his early political career, been seen as a bit of a working-class political poster boy, growing up with a single mother in subsidised council housing in Sydney. He's described himself as progressive. He won the 2022 election, sweeping Labor to power after almost 12 years in opposition. He promised to reignite Australia's post-COVID economy, improve its track record on climate change, lower the cost of living, and hold a referendum on Indigenous rights. Since coming to power, however, Albanese's government has been perceived by many as slow-acting and lacklustre. The cost of living has remained high. Several coal mines were expanded. Journalists revealed Albanese had purchased a multi-million-dollar coastal house when the cost of housing is a nightmare for many Australians. And on his signature policy, the referendum to recognise Indigenous rights and create an Indigenous advisory body to Parliament, was broadly defeated, in no small part to opposition leader Peter Dutton's Vote No campaign. Enter Peter Dutton, the Liberal Party opposition leader and Albanese's rival in this election. A former policeman from Queensland, he is a vocal critic of China. In past Liberal national governments, he's strongly enforced Australia's tactic of sending asylum seekers who arrived by boat to offshore detention centres. He expanded investigative and surveillance powers of federal law enforcement. Many of his critics label him a right-wing populist, even Trumpian, though he disagrees with those characterisations. One of his signature policies going into this election, nuclear power stations across Australia to reduce energy costs. It's a move broadly condemned as unfeasible and unworkable by nuclear scientists, economists, and a strong anti-nuclear sentiment among the Australian public. He's promised a referendum on whether Australia should deport Australian citizens who hold dual nationality if they commit a crime. He wants to expand gas and coal mining, and he advocates cuts of around 40,000 civil servants while promising to ban working from home for government employees. That last pledge has proven a thorn in his side. Many Australians look at Elon Musk's Doge government cuts in the US and don't like what they see. Dutton has since backtracked. And when Trump announced 10% tariffs on Australia, Albanese said that reciprocal tariffs with Australia should be zero. The Australian public is looking at the US and increasingly not liking what it sees, as the electorate begins to find reactionary right-wing populism more and more distasteful. A last-minute tax cut offering from Labor and the news that the inflation rate is falling down has provided a welcome polling boost for Labor's campaign. But it's still a tight race. Dutton brought the Liberal National Coalition from its biggest loss in 7 decades to a chance at being electable. Could he throw out Albanese and Labour after just a single term and lurch Australia towards the right? Or will Albanese and Labour steady the course? Only the results of May 3rd will tell.
So where could this election take Australia, and how much is U.S. policy influencing candidates and voters? Well, joining me now to debate that and much more are from Canberra, Director of the Australian Studies Institute, Mark Kenny; from Sydney, Australian author and journalist Latika Bork; and also from Canberra, former official in the Australian Department of Defence, David Andrews. Thanks all so much for being with me. Quickly, I'd just actually like to start with the debate itself and get your impressions. Mark, I'll begin with you. Was it impactful? Did the format work? Do you think it'll change any voters' minds? Was there a winner?
Yeah, all of these are very good questions, and I suppose they're quite subjective answers, really. This was a different kind of debate from the normal format that we see, very much audience-driven. So it had 100 supposedly undecided voters who were selected by a professional polling group because they were undecided, and they were the ones who were actually putting questions to the leaders. So it wasn't really a debate in the more traditional sense. However, it is the case that each of the leaders was able to respond to those questions. There was some to and fro between the leaders as they answered the questions. They challenged each other's interpretations of things. So we did see some interaction. It was mostly polite. It was fairly pedestrian a lot of the time. There weren't any sort of huge moments of fireworks. And it was interesting. I think a lot of people who were watching it on television, on a screen, would have probably scored it for Peter Dutton, the challenger, whereas in the room, the people who made up the audience, they scored it as a win for Anthony Albanese. And we often see this, that the experience face-to-face can be a bit different from the experience that people have on their television screens. And
interesting,
yeah,
huh?
it's subjective.
Okay, I'll tell you what, I'll take that analysis and let's move on to some more of the substance of the debate and how it might influence or not influence the election. Latika, I'll come to you. Has the rise, over the last 6 months in particular, of Trump and his tariffs in particular, do you think they've changed opinions, especially about the right wing in Australia, and inadvertently empowered the left? Because you've actually called Trump a third candidate in this election.
Yes, very much. I think Donald Trump is the third wheel in the Australian election, which is not necessarily an outcome we would have seen. But the first 3 months of his administration have been so shocking and so brutal that they have really, I think, sent a scare through the Australian public about anyone who might have been sympathising with Donald Trump, or even, as the opposition leader Peter Dutton has done, flirted and copied just a few of his tactics, things like big cuts to the public service, things like big cuts to government waste. Now, these are constant themes in every single federal election that I've covered, but it's only this year that they've become a little doji or a little Trumpy, and that is a problem. So that has really generated a huge groundswell of a rally around the flag effect, which wasn't there this time last year. And it's also made the incumbent Prime Minister have a strength in incumbency. Last year, of course, incumbency was a curse. Inflation was a curse. Both of those things have now receded. And what you're seeing is a more traditional approach towards politics, where the incumbent is actually able to use the resources of government, is actually able to use the stature of being in government as benefits rather than curses. So I think Donald Trump really has changed the dynamic of this election. And I don't think if it weren't for Donald Trump, the Labor Party would be ahead in the polls. Just a couple of months ago, it was looking like it might be back into a minority government, or it could even possibly lose in a worst case scenario. Now the better case scenario for the government is that it could actually even hold its majority. And that is not something people were saying even just 3 or 4 months ago.
Yeah, it's fascinating too, because I mentioned Canada briefly in the introduction, because we're seeing such a similar pattern there as well, according to what your analysis has been. Let me come to David, though, because if you can, talk to us about how these two candidates actually differ in taking on the United States here? I know one of the top questions from the audience was about Gaza, and the conclusion more or less was Australians don't want their money funding weapons being used in Gaza, as per Trump and the United States.
Well, I think that's entirely reasonable, but as the Prime Minister said, there is no Australian funding for weapons in Israel and Gaza. That's not the policy of the government. That's never been the policy of the government. So that is, in some respects, a non-issue, and that both the Prime Minister and the opposition leader, I think, were quite clear on that respect. But you did note a slightly different tilt or expression of the way that the opposition leader framed his position, in that he probably took a more pro-Israel position, whereas Anthony Albanese emphasised the Labor Party's approach to a two-state solution and its desire for a ceasefire. Now, I'm not saying these are polar opposites, but certainly there is an expectation that were the Liberal Party to be elected, that they would seek to sort of recognise Jerusalem as Israel's capital, which had been done under the previous Morrison government, and that's not a position of the Labor Party. So there are definitely some distinctions, but I wouldn't necessarily think of them as being radically far apart.
Yeah, I just mean it was really interesting to see them have to re-clarify then that Australian money is not being used on weapons for the IDF, and that Gaza was such a priority question. I feel that's different. Go ahead.
There's quite a significant population of people from Lebanon and from elsewhere in the Middle East that are migrants and live in Australia, and so it's a very big issue in the population. It's one that's been discussed at great length for over a year now. So it's, at one level, I'm not surprised, maybe because of those distinctions in policy between the government and the opposition, that people would take the chance to press them on the issue. But part of the problem is the opacity in the way these so defence exports and decisions are articulated, is that they talk about controlled and non-controlled goods, which could technically contain weapons and munitions, but I think the government's been quite clear that that's not a thing that they export or have chosen to do so. So I think it's telling that there are foreign policy considerations in the election, but I think I'd probably reflect on the bulk of the question being very much focused on domestic issues around cost of living, around inflation and mortgage prices.
But it's interesting, Mark, I'll come back to you, because the issue of Gaza does actually, it's of interest especially to immigrants, recent or otherwise, in Australia that can vote. So what did they make of immigration in this debate? I mean, we knew kind of in many countries xenophobia, they say anti-Semitism, anti-Islamism, anti-Islamic vote, Islamophobia as they call it. The sentiment is playing a role here among those voters.
Yes, it definitely is. There's a couple of dimensions to this. One is the sort of cost of living dimension, which seems to frame just about everything, or find its way into just about every issue. And in the case of immigration as a broader issue, we see it reflected in concerns about too much competition for housing, the overloading of various services and infrastructure. There's a bit of political campaigning coming from the hard right in this election campaign, which is explicitly calling out high levels of immigration as being part of the problem for a lot of people, overloading services and the like. Now, Peter Dutton's opposition is being more subtle than that, but he is proposing to have a 30,000 place cut in international student visas. There's a cap already that the government has on student visas, and Dutton is planning to take that further. So that speaks to, I think, a sort of a cost of living frame of this, and perhaps to a sense that some people have that immigration is a problem in itself. But on the question,
just quickly, do you think Peter Dutton is being more subtle about it, as you put it, because of what Australians have been seeing in the United States and the hard line, some say offensive line on immigration that Trump has taken?
I think no doubt about that. I think in Australia, Australia is a very proud multicultural country. That doesn't mean there aren't tensions in some places or around some questions. And we've just been talking about the frame of the Middle East, for example, which has obviously very inflamed tensions and passions around that debate. But as a general rule, I think it's fair to say that Peter Dutton is being much more sort of careful and subtle, as you say, in the way this issue is framed. So he's wanting to say, and he said it a number of times during this debate, that he's very proud of Australia's multiculturalism and the contribution that migrants have made to the country, which is a good thing, seeing as just about everyone here is a migrant or a descendant of a migrant. But nonetheless, it does. And the concern is for some people that some of this, these policy statements and these answers that are produced in the political fray are a form of dog whistling about migration, about high levels of immigration, and a sort of a sense of people being overwhelmed and the like.
Okay, Latika, we can then look again further afield, and if you can tell us how much voters are also thinking about China and the Australian relationship with Beijing. Could China now be seen as a safer and more predictable partner in spite of what's been happening in the defense arena?
This is a really perceptive question, because this is the first election, at least in a decade, where China has not been the main foreign policy or security challenge theme that has dominated the contest. And that was really prevalent at the last election. It's almost non-existent at this election. And that is somewhat of a surprise. But going back to the earlier conversation about Donald Trump, it's basically the case that he has obliterated all conversation about China being our strategic threat, because the more immediate threat that everyone now sees are these global tariffs coming in for not just us, but for our major trading partner in China, what that will do to our economy. And it's at a time where we don't have the fiscal buffer that we used to have in being able to deal with economic and international shocks like this. So China has really receded as a security question at this debate. That doesn't mean the security challenge of China has abated. It just means we're not seeing it play out. It is still to come in some way. The opposition is going to announce that it will raise defence spending, and that will be a clear difference of opinion, but that's not going to move the election. And to your question about whether this throws Australia or even ASEAN back into the arms of China, as opposed to any flirtation they might have been doing with the United States, both in a security sense and an economic partnership, yes, look, absolutely. I do think that's going to be the case, and it will make it very, very challenging for those in Australia who want to see a distancing of both the economic relationship with China and a deeper security relationship with the United States. That argument is going to be extremely hard to prosecute in Australia over the next few years, and at least while Donald Trump and MAGA have control of the White House.
And, you know, David, something someone say is symbolic of the kind of relationship between Australia and China, and then comparing it with the U.S., comes down to the port of Darwin, if I can put it that way. Some had said, you know, the way we saw Trump handling the Panama Canal was a more extreme version of the way Australia was looking at the port of Darwin, and that they no longer want China to have control, and they're talking about taking control back from the Chinese. Are we hearing a lot of talk about that anymore, or does it seem like Australia might soften its line because they don't want this kind of confrontation with China?
Well, I'd agree with Latika that China has probably receded somewhat from the immediate conversation in Australia's political context right now, and that the US has drawn so much attention. But the one exception to that probably is the port of Darwin, with both the government and the opposition having articulated a desire to I don't want to say reclaim control, because it's a lease of an existing piece of infrastructure, and that you can't pick up the port of Darwin and carry it away somewhere. It still exists, and so if it came down to it, then who the leaseholder is neither here nor there. Now, this has been a topic of conversation over the best part of a decade in Australian politics, over who's at fault or who's not at fault, or who's responsible for having first leased it and then not leased it, and it's been reviewed 2 or 3 times. And so I think it's probably now a point of expediency as much as anything else to make this symbolic gesture to some extent to reflect those desires of the Trump administration about ensuring that key pieces of infrastructure aren't administered or in that sense controlled by Chinese companies or entities, that this seems like a very easy win that the government can make and keep itself in the good graces of the Trump administration, which, as I think we've all seen, is highly unpredictable. And ensuring that those policies are adhered to is a principal and driving challenge for the government or the opposition. I mean, the Prime Minister said this evening that to his mind, that defence and security and tariffs should not be connected. So he views them as very separate things, separate conversations. One is an economic conversation, one speaks to our long-term 75, 80-year defence relationship with the United States, which, though it's going through obviously a very difficult state at the moment, is not something that either party of government seeks to sort of sacrifice on the altar of tariffs and trade.
Right. But like you said, it is highly unpredictable. And Mark, I mean, as far as the economy is concerned then, could better reconciling the Beijing-Canberra relationship perhaps compensate then for the struggling, unpredictable U.S.-Australia trade relationship?
Well, the relationship between Australia and China in an economic sense is in pretty good condition. It's been through its own period of punitive tariffs that Beijing slapped on Australia, and Australia weathered that for a long period. There was a freeze of contact between the governments, and it was a difficult time for Australian exporters. They found other markets in many cases, and eventually we seem to have got through that. So there's a huge integration between our two economies, and at the moment there doesn't seem to be any great interruption to that. The security framework, however, is always an important one, and it does have the potential to, as it did with that diplomatic freeze between Australia and Beijing, it's always possible that could happen again. I mean, that China will not be happy about Australia effectively reneging on a 99-year lease to take back control of the Port of Darwin, even if there is bipartisan support for it here in Australia amongst the two major parties. And of course, there was recently Chinese naval vessels circumnavigating the country. That became quite a significant political domestic issue here, and it gets referred to fairly frequently as Peter Dutton suggesting that this is because Anthony Albanese isn't a strong enough leader to control these kinds of things, which is not particularly reasonable. But so much in this area is about the optics, as indeed, as I think David's referring to there, as indeed is the whole process of dissolving that 99-year lease and taking back running of the Port of Darwin from that Chinese entity. I mean, it's largely a matter of optics.
Right.
But nonetheless, it's going to happen.
Yeah. Latika, I could see you largely agreed there, but we only have a minute and a half really left. So I wanted to ask about one more kind of crucial area, and that's about the climate and climate change. Australia has been miserably affected by extreme weather, and climate advocates had criticized Albanese for approving some coal mines over this course of his term. But then again, Dutton is pretty much a massive proponent of coal and is somewhat a climate change skeptic. So how is that faring now in the judgment of voters in this debate and going forward? Because this is something Trump has taken a very hard climate skeptic line on.
It's pretty much being gazumped by the cost of living crisis. So now when we're talking about energy, yes, the pathway to net zero is still the dominant narrative, and that's the goal, but there is a divergence. So now we have the opposition favouring a gas-led transition to eventually nuclear, which is a big deal for Australia. There's been bipartisan opposition to that for as long as I've been alive. And this is a really new frontier, but it's not necessarily popular. And the Labor Party, which opposes nuclear, has been very successfully attacking the opposition on that. The Labor Party wants a renewables-led future, and it's going all in on those things, on solar, on wind farms, on batteries. And that is popular in terms of the transition. But in terms of cost of living, the coalition has made a lot of, I think, inroads in linking the cost of energy, which is very high in Australia, to that transition to renewables. I think it's still an open question as to where that debate eventually lands in Australia. But for now, it's not so much a climate crisis narrative that we're talking about it. It's very much how much energy bills cost.
Okay. David, I can just give you a minute for your final thoughts.
Well, perhaps just to build on what he was just saying, that energy piece is a really touchstone issue, but I think it also connects to this growing trend we're seeing in international politics, particularly over the last few months, of a certain nationalising and fragmenting vision of the world order. So there used to be a more consensus-driven model of liberalising trade that includes gas and resources, things that Australia exports. But now we're seeing much more of a focus on retaining a greater share of those things onshore to supply the domestic market and to bring down prices domestically. So even though that's an Australia-focused issue, it has international implications, such as in our relationship with Japan and South Korea and others. So I think it's that domestic international nexus we need to be keeping an eye on.
Okay, that will have to be the final word for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists really so much for being with us. I'm sure we'll be revisiting this topic again very soon, and our viewers, of course, for being with us as well. Remember, you can follow us on social media, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.